they've seen the limits of Russian power. So if you talk about Venezuela as a very, important case, look, Russia gave Venezuela some military equipment, including the air defenses. You mentioned that. It was a trading partner for Venezuela. But when the Americans decided they were going to shake their fist and eventually kidnap Nicolas Maduro, Russia couldn't do anything about it. When the United States, a few days after that, chased one of the ships that was trying to move oil from Venezuela to other countries, and the Russians had reflagged it, renamed it as the Marinera, the Americans intercepted it south of Iceland, international waters, despite the fact that the Russians said, we have a submarine and we have other vessels that are monitoring this. And, and that wasn't, that huge and earth-shattering geopolitical event, but it was very symbolic. Look, we can take your ship if we want to. If you talk, I think, more seriously about Syria, at the end of 2024, when you had the Turkish-supported anti-Assad forces, the leader of whom is now the president of Syria, Mr. al-Shara, Assad's forces melted away, and the Russians weren't going to step in to save Assad. The most they were going to do was to give him, his family, and a few of his associates a one-way flight to Moscow. And if the Americans decide to make a huge move on Cuba, Russia's not going to be able to save Cuba. And that's kind of the reality that's taken place here. So what's happened here is that just as in the specific sense that Russia's second largest army in the world has been exposed for its not quite second largest military influence in the world because of Ukrainian resistance, so Russia's political influence and its geopolitical influence is not as great as they say it was. And I'll say one other thing here, because it's just a wider point, because I've said this long before 2022 and so on. There are far too many analysts out there who got deceived by Russia blowing smoke about how there's this alternative world order. They'll talk about a multipolar world, and they'll talk about how BRICS is so important. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa will set the geopolitical terms. Like heck you will. Those countries don't even get along with each other. India and China don't get along with each other. South Africa has very little love lost for Russia these days. So Russia ran this game. And again, it wasn't the reason why it invaded Ukraine. But at the same time they invaded Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, they ran this game in 2022 that we're a great power. We're a great global power. They're not. They're not. And we're going to get people commenting on this YouTube thing. Yeah. Look at Russia. Look at all the potential it has. Fine. Tell yourself that. But the fact here is that Vladimir Putin's legacy, in a specific sense of a greater Russia, has not succeeded in Ukraine, and his legacy that he wanted to leave of a greater Russia, going back to the Soviet Union sweep at the height of the Soviet Empire, that's not working out too well either.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, Sofia. Hello, Ukraine.
U.S. President Donald Trump said that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is holding up a peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. According to Reuters, in an exclusive interview, Trump told Reuters he believes Putin is ready to make a deal while Ukraine has been more reluctant to move forward. He did not give specific details on why does he think Zelensky is hesitant. Also, Trump's comments contrast with views from many US and European officials who say Russia has shown little interest in ending the war. Meanwhile, US Special Envoy Steven Witkoff and Jared Kushner are seeking to travel to Moscow soon to participate in possible meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, according to Bloomberg. The visit is aimed at advancing talks on a possible peace deal to end the war. Bloomberg said the timing and details are not yet final. A White House official said no visit has been confirmed, and also recently President Trump said that he was not confident enough to confirm such meeting would happen in the future. However, what is your assessment of the potential outcome of the upcoming meeting between Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin? And again, where are we now in these negotiations to end the war in Ukraine?
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Let's put all of this together. So the Trump statement plus the idea of Witkoff and Kushner going to Moscow. First of all, with Donald Trump's statements, never treat them as a statement of fact. They just simply are his mood. And we know last week he was saying, oh, that Mr. Putin, he's not helping us. He's doing, why won't he work with us? And then this week he says, oh, that Zelensky, he is the barrier to peace. And Putin, he will agree to peace with us. Next week he could be back on, oh, Zelensky, he is okay and Putin is bad. The reality here is that Trump often just simply reflects what has just been told to him or the latest development. In this case, what we have is that Ukraine and Europe have finally gotten U.S. involvement in the 20-point main document, and there are supporting documents, and they cover a proposed ceasefire to halt the Russian invasion. They cover possible territorial proposals, such as the idea of a demilitarized economic zone in Donetsk in the east of Ukraine. They cover provisions for recovery for Ukraine, and importantly, they set out security guarantees. Now, while there's still some details on the security guarantees to be worked out, the importance here is it's not just that there will be UK and French forces that will be in Ukraine as part of monitoring, enforcing the ceasefire, supporting Ukrainian troops near the front line, but there will be American involvement through their oversight of air power, probably based in Poland or another neighboring country. Now, that's significant. That's huge, because if you were talking in late October, the Kremlin thought it had the upper hand with Witkoff and Kushner with this ultimatum to Ukraine, which is you give up all of the Donetsk region. The rest of Ukraine is weak. It does not have significant Western assistance. It does not have significant security guarantees. Now, here we are 2.5 months later, and Witkoff and Kushner are about to go out to Moscow. So how do you get the Kremlin to accept this proposal when the Kremlin has quite clearly said, we're not accepting a ceasefire. We want all of the Donetsk region as ours. We want you to recognize it as ours. And we do not want European forces involved inside Ukraine. How do you get the Kremlin to accept that? And I think Witkoff talks to Trump, or Trump looks around and thinks, if I say something nice about Mr. Putin, and if I say, oh, Mr. Zelensky's the problem, then the Kremlin might agree to this proposal, or it might agree to at least discuss this proposal. And I think it's just simply as this. It's just a very, very narrow businessman's view that Trump always has, which doesn't fit politics, and it definitely doesn't fit the Ukraine-Russia situation. So I get frustrated with the media because they get led by the nose by Trump, and it's like, oh my God, what's he just said? Oh no, what's it mean? Oh, this is earth-shattering. And the reality here is you've got to look behind Trump's statement as to where we are with the really serious discussions. And the really serious discussions have not been with Trump. They've been with the U.S. officials, a lot of whom are unnamed. But there'll be military officials, intelligence officials, diplomatic officials. Those are the serious discussions. That's where we've gotten movement. And we know that the serious discussion will be what happens when Witkoff and Kushner go to Moscow. Will Witkoff and Kushner stay? Will they maintain support for that Ukraine-Europe document that has been worked out? Or when Putin rejects it, will Witkoff and Kushner put up their hands and go, oh gosh, well, that's it. We can't do this document anymore. We have to come up with something else. And that's the big question mark, rather than Donald Trump's latest tweet or crazed statement that he gives to reporters.
Let's cover also Russia's position abroad. According to Bloomberg, Russian closest allies are getting frustrated with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, saying Moscow didn't help them in the most critical moments. The report says countries that have long relied on Russia's political, military and intel backing, including Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Cuba, now feel neglected as the Kremlin prioritizes its fight against Ukraine. Officials from several nations told Bloomberg they expected stronger help from Russia during recent crises, but were left on their own. In Venezuela, officials described Russia as a paper tiger and Russia's guarantees as paper tiger. They said Russian air defense systems were not fully operational. Also, the disappointment has sparked doubts about whether Russia can still serve as a reliable protector. And Syria has also felt this. Bloomberg reported that President Bashar al-Assad's position weakened due to some shortages of Russia's support to Syria, and also in Iran, despite recent statement made by Moscow. Iranian officials do not expect Russia to help Iran in case of military attack on Iran by US forces. By launching the war against Ukraine, don't you think that Putin aimed to improve Russia's status as global power, but instead he has weakened Russia's influence abroad?
Well, I think Putin launched the full-scale invasion on Ukraine to conquer Ukraine. I don't think it had to do with Russia's status around the world. He just wanted to grab your territory and make it part of Greater Russia. I think the question here is what's been the effect of that? You know, if you look at February 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, Russia had this position where it had propped up the Assad regime, where it kept it from falling ever since its full-scale military intervention there in 2015. It had a significant presence through the Wagner Group and other paramilitary forces in sub-Saharan Africa. You can look at Mali, for example, where they were gaining quite a bit of influence. You go to Latin America, and they've got the ties with the Maduro regime. And of course, you know, they have the long-standing ties with Cuba that go back to the 1959. But you could go even further afield and say that Russia was looking like, okay, well, we can project this power. Look, we're a member of BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Look, we're a member of Asian organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. How influential we are. CTSO, right? Well, let's, you know, almost 4 years later, and let's talk what's happened. I don't think it's all because of Russia being tied down by Ukraine, but what has happened is it's not as much as these countries are really mad at Russia. I think it's just that they've seen the limits of Russian power. So if you talk about Venezuela as a very, you know, important case, look, Russia gave Venezuela some military equipment, including the air defenses. You mentioned that. It was a trading partner for Venezuela. But when the Americans decided they were going to shake their fist and eventually kidnap Nicolas Maduro, Russia couldn't do anything about it. When the United States, a few days after that, chased one of the ships that was trying to move oil from Venezuela to other countries, and the Russians had reflagged it, renamed it as the Marinera, the Americans intercepted it south of Iceland, international waters, despite the fact that the Russians said, oh, we have a submarine and we have other vessels that are monitoring this. And, and that wasn't, that huge and earth-shattering geopolitical event, but it was very symbolic. Look, we can take your ship if we want to. If you talk, I think, more seriously about Syria, at the end of 2024, when you had the Turkish-supported anti-Assad forces, the leader of whom is now the president of Syria, Mr. al-Shara, Assad's forces melted away, and the Russians weren't going to step in to save Assad. The most they were going to do was to give him, his family, and a few of his associates a one-way flight to Moscow. And if the Americans decide to make a huge move on Cuba, Russia's not going to be able to save Cuba. And that's kind of the reality that's taking place here. So what's happened here is that just as in the specific sense that Russia's second largest army in the world has been exposed for its not quite second largest military influence in the world because of Ukrainian resistance, so Russia's political influence and its geopolitical influence is not as great as they say it was. And I'll say one other thing here, because it's just a wider point, because I've said this long before 2022 and so on. There are far too many analysts out there who got deceived by Russia blowing smoke about how there's this alternative world order. They'll talk about a multipolar world, and they'll talk about how BRICS is so important. You know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa will set the geopolitical terms. Like heck you will. You know, those countries don't even get along with each other. India and China don't get along with each other. South Africa has very little love lost for Russia these days. So Russia ran this game. And again, it wasn't the reason why it invaded Ukraine. But at the same time they invaded Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, they ran this game in 2022 that we're a great power. We're a great global power. They're not. You know, they're not. And we're going to get people commenting on this YouTube thing. Yeah. Look at Russia. Look at all the potential it has. You know, fine. Tell yourself that. But the fact here is that Vladimir Putin's legacy, in a specific sense of a greater Russia, has not succeeded in Ukraine. And his legacy that he wanted to leave of a greater Russia, going back to the Soviet Union sweep at the height of the Soviet Empire, that's not working out too well either.
Meanwhile, there are growing signs of power struggle inside the Russia. Ukraine's military intelligence reports that Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov is in critical condition, suffering from kidney failure, and members of his family have reportedly gathered together at the hospital in Chechnya as a behind-the-scene discussion begin over who could succeed him as a head of Chechen Republic. And according to journalists from The Times, Kadyrov is preparing his 18-year-old son, Adam, to take the power. And actually, despite his age, Adam Kadyrov has already been granted several high-ranking titles, and now he serves as a secretary of the Chechen Security Council. But this succession may pose a problem for Moscow. The Kremlin is eager to retain tight control over the republic, and journalists report that the nearly 100 of Kadyrov's relatives currently hold positions within the Chechnya's administration, underlining how deeply power is concentrated within the family. And my question is, how risky is the power transition in Chechnya for the Kremlin, and could a weakening of Kadyrov's grip reopen the question of independence of Chechnya?
Yeah, with respect both to Ukrainian military intelligence, who do tend to play up the possibility of power struggles in Russia, and I want to understand why, and with respect to the Times that tend to play that up as well. No, I think, you know, let's look at this from a realistic point of view. First of all, since the complete suppression of the Chechen rebellion in those two very, very bloody wars, now going back almost 30 years, you don't really have a Chechen opposition movement that's in position to challenge Kadyrov or the Kadyrov family. They keep a very tight grip on that region. And the other thing is that, Kadyrov is the Kremlin servant. Kadyrov, not only in terms of being a political servant, he has provided a lot of the military forces that have been used in Ukraine. And you all know that very, very well. The question of what happens if the elder Kadyrov passes away, and with someone like Adam Kadyrov coming in, is how effective is that new leader? And if Adam Kadyrov is as ruthless as his father and is as effective as his father in maintaining what is effectively a despotism or regional despotism, then the Kremlin's going to be okay with that, right? In other words, you keep giving us the manpower we need for the special military operation. You make sure that there's no rising in Chechnya. You contribute resources to us. Now, if Adam Kadyrov can't do that, if he can't deliver on those things, then I'm sure if there's someone else in the family who approaches the Kremlin and says, look, I can do this for you, then the Kremlin may tap someone on the shoulder. I mean, the easiest analogy for me, if you go back in your history, it's like when you have like a monarchy and they have these little lords in parts of the country that are out there, right? And they run like these little sections of the country. And it's like, does this lord keep the population in control, right? And if they do, then the big emperor, Putin, he's happy. If people rise up against the lord, or if the lord is ineffective and you've got a problem in that territory, then the court cracks down. Moscow will crack down. So no, I mean, as much as we would like to see Chechens finally escape what has been a very bloody and brutal rule, I don't see that easing in the near future.
I also want to talk about Russian casualties in the Russian war against Ukraine during these 4 years. Russian forces have lost an estimated 1,213,000 troops, including 415,000 killed or wounded last year alone, and that's data according to the UK Ministry of Defence, citing intelligence data. And British intelligence also warns that Russian losses are expected to remain extremely high this year. And at the same time, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, has revealed another striking figure. Last year, Russia met its mobilization target, adding 406,000 new troops to its army. And that means that Russia lost more soldiers last year than it was able to recruit over the entire year. And one more remarkable comparison: this war now lasted longer than according to Russian terminology, the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany, and the great patriotic war. And given those numbers, losses exceeded Russia's ability to mobilize. Is that war can still Moscow actually sustain, or we are reaching a breaking point at Russia's military capacity? And can Vladimir Putin still justify such a massive human losses to his people?
Yeah, first, the easy question. Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the number of casualties. He doesn't care. It could be, 1.2 million. It could be 2. It could be 3 million. What Putin cares about is, can he get more people onto the battlefield, no matter how many of his troops are killed or wounded. So your big question here is about mobilization. And General Syrsky's comment is right, that I think there are challenges for Russian mobilization now. And to be honest with you, one of the challenges is that there's not as much money on the table to go in and to fight in Ukraine. The bonuses aren't as great as they used to be, and families of those who were killed are not getting the payoffs to the same extent that they got. So could that affect the mobilization? I wouldn't want to predict that, and I do also think we need to be realistic. Again, as valiant as Ukraine's resistance has been, and I expect it to continue, the Russians have a manpower advantage. Even if they cannot mobilize as many people, they still have that manpower advantage, and that will continue in the near future. So I think what you just simply have to do is say whether or not they can mobilize the people. You have to look at the wider factors that affect mobilization. So one of the factors that affects mobilization is going to be Russia's economy. So you need to maintain the pressure on Russia's economy, because if you constrain the economy, there's not as much money and incentives there to put people on the front line. Secondly, you need to mobilize the resources for Ukraine, not only to hold the front line, but to counterattack inside Russia. Because the more that Russia has to devote expenditure to rebuilding its facilities that get struck, whether we're talking about oil refineries, whether we're talking about drone production plants, whether we're talking about engineering plants, that's a constraint as well. And you have to mobilize support for Ukraine in the sense that it has the financial support to keep going, while Russia, you hope, is isolated in where it can get funds from. So I think, with all respect to this, there are enough desperate people probably in Russia, because it pays pretty well to go into the military compared to the salaries that you get in many parts of the country. There are enough desperate people in Russia that probably will volunteer, even at great risk, to keep fighting here. But if Russia can't keep giving them the incentives to go to the front line, that may not continue.
Well, Vladimir Putin has said that Ukraine will not be able to mobilize its military forces. Will this Let's also cover US foreign policy and Trump's willingness to take over Greenland. US President Donald Trump said Wednesday that anything less than US control over Greenland is fully unacceptable. For him, arguing the territory is critical for national security and could strengthen NATO. Trump warned that if US does not act and take over Greenland, Russia or China might move in, and said having Greenland under US control would make NATO far more effective. Danish officials warned that such move would strain relations with NATO, and analysts say Greenland's location is also important for military and intel purposes. However, critics and other experts argue Trump's comments and his move could risk damaging relations with allies among NATO members and escalating tensions with Russia and China. Also, I would like to add that recently President Trump said that he conducted this phone call with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and he said, quote, that Rutte probably supported his initiative or something like that. However, NATO's press office did not confirm this, and General Secretary Mark Rutte did not comment this in such way that he supports US annexing Greenland. What is your assessment of current stage of Trump's possible war against NATO member? Can US really attack Greenland? How can this look like? And could this mean the end of NATO?
Now you got me started. You know what I said earlier about Trump just saying things, off the top of his head, like when he was talking about Zelensky and Putin. Well, same thing with Greenland. He gets these headlines by saying crazy stuff about Greenland. We're going to go invade Greenland. But then there's a serious reality about it. You just sort of laid it out, but let me just repeat it for folks. Because I'm a kid of the Cold War. I grew up with this whole idea of NATO. You all were in Ukraine, having part of the Soviet sphere. And here I am in 2026, and the Trump camp, not everybody in the administration, but important people in the Trump camp are talking about, we could have a military invasion, not of Russia, not of China. We could have a military invasion of a fellow NATO member, Denmark. Now, remember, if the U.S. actually invaded Greenland and invaded Denmark, it presents NATO members with a choice. Because under Article 5 of NATO, if one member is attacked, the rest of them have to come to its defense. So every other NATO member, France, Germany, Sweden, Finland, have to make the decision if U.S. was going to invade Denmark or invade Greenland, whether they're going to send troops up there to face off against the Americans. Now, I don't think it's going to get to that point. I think actually it's going to be politics and economics. But let me also say something just to get it on the record with you folks up here, because as I said, it's important when Trump says dumb stuff to put the facts out there. Greenland is already defended, not only by Denmark, but by NATO and by the United States. It is already defended. Denmark is a member of NATO. NATO, therefore, provides maritime defense for Greenland. It provides air power for Greenland. It provides land resources if necessary for Greenland. Indeed, as I speak to you, in a very symbolic sign of that support, there are 6 European countries and Canada who are sending military personnel to Greenland as part of an exercise. And that includes France, Germany, the Netherlands, are 3 of those NATO members. I think Norway, Sweden are 2 of the others. But even equally important, since 1951, the United States has had an agreement for the protection of Greenland with Denmark. The U.S. had 17 bases at the height of the Cold War. They were an early warning system against the Soviets. They still have an air base at Patufic. They could put in as many military personnel as they want to. There is no need for the U.S. to invade to provide security for Greenland because the security is already there. nor is it the case that Russia and China are threatening to invade Greenland or that they are dominant in the waters off of Greenland. There has not been a Chinese warship off the coast of Greenland for more than a decade. There have been more Russian ships in the zone, the U.S. economic zone off Alaska, than there have been off Greenland in recent years. So the Trump reason for supposedly invading Greenland is nonsense. So what is happening here? Greenland has rare earth minerals. It is the 8th largest, if you treated it as a country, it's part of Denmark, but if you treat it as a separate country, it would be the 8th largest country. It has the 8th largest supply in the world. Its supply of rare earth minerals is almost as great as that in the entire United States. It is estimated to be worth trillions of dollars. Trump and his business buddies would love to get a hold of that. And Trump likes stuff. So in addition to that, and probably equally important, J.D. Vance, who is Trump's vice president, does not like Europe, or at least he does not like the European Union. He does not like most current European governments, including Ukraine. He is responsible for the national security strategy at the end of last year, in which the United States said it would try to break up the European Union. So J.D. Vance would be quite happy weakening the European Union and weakening Denmark by getting Greenland. And there are other officials who ally with him. There are other Trump officials who do not agree with that. And significantly, I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio is one who thinks the U.S. has to keep cooperating with Europe. So where are we? I think the American proposal is that either buy Greenland off of Denmark, and the figure of around $700 billion US dollars has been mentioned. That's not going to happen because Denmark's not going to sell Greenland, and Greenland doesn't want to be sold to the US. The alternative is for Greenland to become independent, and then the United States to offer it a compact of free association in which the US has primary economic access. And it would be responsible for the defense and foreign policy of Greenland. But for that to happen, Greenland would not only have to become independent, it would have to want that. That's not going to happen. So the Americans do not have options here. None. What happened yesterday, and I know I've taken some time with this just to set it all out, is that just as Europe has been effective with Ukraine at getting to the right Americans, Europe supported Denmark and Greenland in getting a meeting with Marco Rubio, who is probably the most sensible of the Trump people dealing with this. The problem here is that J.D. Vance insisted in being part of that meeting. However, despite the threat of Vance, the outcome of that meeting was a working group. Now, I don't know if you've been in business, if you've been in academia, if you've been in politics, but quite often you form a working group to buy time and just to avoid facing a hard decision. So that's what's happened here, is you get a working group to discuss this. Meanwhile, you see what the next move of Vance is. That's even more important. That's even more important than Trump's thought bubbles, to be honest with you. But I will say that as much as I'm saying I'm not looking at a U.S. military invasion of Greenland, the very fact that we are talking about this is highly disruptive, because the one country that will exploit this to say this is a sign that the U.S. and Europe are divided, and that they're divided over Greenland, they're divided over Ukraine, the country that has been exploiting it all week in its state media coverage is Russia.
Let's also cover the situation in Iran. U.S. President Donald Trump says Iran protester killing have stopped following his threats to bomb Iran. And speaking from the Oval Office, Trump said he had been told by very important sources in Iran that the crackdown on demonstrators had ceased. He added that he would be very upset if the violence resumed, but Bloomberg noted that U.S. intelligence has not independently verified the claims. The remarks came amid widespread protests in Iran, where human rights groups say thousands have been killed in government crackdowns over the past year. And Trump's comments also coincided with the drop in global oil prices as markets interrupted the potential de-escalation in U.S.-Iranian tensions as reducing risks. Bloomberg reported that while Trump discussed a possible pause in violence, U.S. military options remain on the table. What is your opinion about the possible U.S. intervention in Iran?
Let me say just first and foremost, and I've worked inside Iran. I've been involved as part of a university in Tehran. This was before 2009 with the protest against the rigged presidential election. Since 2009, I've been told if I go to Iran, I go to prison. So I have been fortunate, however, to have built up many friendships with people who are inside Iran. The starting point here is I'm actually concerned not with Trump's words. I'm concerned with what happens with Iranians who are trying to get political, economic, and social rights. So I'm just going to set that out first and foremost. Therefore, my question is whether the United States helps those Iranians or not. Let me say, first of all, in terms of Trump's latest statements, we don't know the state of the protest, and we don't know whether or not protesters are still getting killed because for a week, Iran has cut off the internet. So it is very hard to get in contact with people inside Iran. It's very hard for people inside Iran to communicate with each other. Now, again, because I've got friends and contacts in Iran and some of them can get access to Starlink, I know a bit about what's happening there. But to simply say, as Trump did yesterday, oh, they suddenly stopped killing. And the confirmed death toll, by the way, is now around about 3,500 people. And the actual death toll will be far higher than that because you'll have a lot of deaths that occurred, but you're still trying to confirm identities. So why did Trump say this yesterday? Because during Wednesday, European and Israeli officials, who I think had been briefed by Americans, were saying there's going to be an attack within 24 hours, right? Within 24 hours. Hours later, Trump comes up and goes, oh, no. I've been assured that not only are there no more killings, they will not execute anybody. And I know that even as he said, the Iranians are not executing anybody, they are threatening protesters with long prison sentences. And they're threatening some of them with sentences that could carry the death penalty. I know that is a fact. What happened here is this is where you have to go back to Trump's personality rather than just politics. Donald Trump likes to pose as a tough guy. So up until yesterday afternoon, he was posing as a tough guy and saying, oh, yeah, I can strike the regime. I can hit the regime. But at the same time, he was saying, but, they want to negotiate with me. They want to negotiate with me. Because Donald Trump also likes to say, I'm a president of peace. I can get deals done. Who were those people who told him the killings had stopped? Who are those very important people? All the Iranian regime has to do is get a message to Trump and say, oh, we're not going to kill anybody anymore. It's all okay, so you don't need to attack us. We're not going to execute anybody anymore, so you don't need to attack us. And Trump flips. And he flipped from saying, attack's going to take place, to saying, okay, for now we don't attack. Now he could flip back. But let me bring this back to the fundamental. None of this helps the Iranian protesters. Because the moment that the U.S. attacks Iran with military force, it means the regime can say the protests are on behalf of the U.S. and Israel. These protesters are just puppets of the U.S. and Israel. Look at what the Americans have done to us. And they will undermine the protest. So whichever way Trump goes, the best thing is for the United States not to launch military force against Iran, but to get adults in the room to talk about the better way of helping Iranians, which is opening up communications and freeing political prisoners.
Scott Lucas, professor of the international politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, was today with us. Professor Lucas, thank you very much for your time and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sofia. Glory to the heroes.
Thank you. Glory to Ukraine.